Have you ever noticed how being with certain relatives can be more exhausting than comforting? As if their mere presence triggers something inside you, a tension in the air, a heaviness in your chest, an urge to leave the room. Many people over 50 admit to feeling relief when family gatherings are over, and then soon after they feel guilty. After all, we grew up hearing that family is sacred, that blood ties are eternal, that there is nothing more important than being together. But what about when being together hurts? What about when what should be home turns into a field of uncomfortable silence or hurtful words? These feelings, as difficult as they are to admit, are common, but they are rarely discussed in depth. When someone says they prefer to keep their distance from certain relatives, they are often seen as ungrateful, cold, or bitter. No one stops to ask, what lies behind this distance? What is going on in the soul of someone who does not feel comfortable among their own? Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, was one of the first to claim that the root of our greatest conflicts is rarely in the present. Instead, they are buried in the unconscious. And the family is often the most fertile ground for these roots to grow. It is there that we form our first bonds and also our first wounds. It is in our mother's gaze, our father's words, our grandparents' silence, comparisons between siblings, unspoken expectations, and veiled judgments that our psyche begins to take shape. For Jung, family life is where unconscious complexes manifest themselves most strongly. Complexes of inferiority, rejection, abandonment, obligation. These are emotions that do not choose logic. They just emerge, like waves that drag us into emotional states that we sometimes cannot even name. That is why a simple family gathering can leave us exhausted for days. But that's not all. Jung also tells us about the shadow, everything we were forced to repress in order to be accepted. The child who learned to swallow their tears, the teenager who stifled their spontaneity so as not to embarrass their parents, the adult who still feels guilty for wanting distance from their own mother. All of this goes to a hidden place inside us, and the family, contrary to popular belief, does not forget. It activates. All it takes is an innocent comment, a tone of voice, a seemingly harmless comparison, and that's it. We are transported back to childhood. We go back to being that person who couldn't make mistakes, who needed to please, who couldn't express anger, who had to smile even when in pain. How many of us still live under these masks, even after the age of 50? And here comes another central concept of Jung, the persona. The persona is the mask we wear to be socially accepted. With relatives, this mask is usually old, heavy, outdated. It no longer matches who we have become. But often we are still forced to wear it, because if we don't, we will be criticized, excluded, misunderstood, and that hurts. At 50, 60, 70, many begin to realize that they can no longer stand these emotional games, that they no longer have the energy to participate in empty conversations, pretense, subtle disputes for affection or approval. They begin to value their own peace, to desire sincere relationships where they can be who they really are and not who others expect them to be. But this liberation comes at a price, and one of the first signs that you are in this process is precisely the discomfort you feel around certain people in your own family. You are not becoming insensitive, you are just waking up, and that, as lonely as it may seem, is a sign of maturity. In this video, we will explore 12 psychological reasons, all based on Jung's ideas, that explain why it is so difficult to be with some relatives. You will understand that you are not alone, that this anguish has a name, an origin, and above all, a way out. Let's walk together through the labyrinths of the family soul, and who knows, maybe we'll discover a new way of relating to ourselves and to others. Reason 1. The mirrored shadow in relatives. Carl Jung claimed that everything that bothers us in others can help us understand ourselves. It's a simple phrase, but one that hides a profound truth. The discomfort we feel towards certain relatives is not always related to their behavior, but to something that exists within us and that we avoid facing. This hidden dimension of the psyche is what Jung called the shadow. The shadow is composed of all the qualities, feelings, and impulses that have been repressed throughout our lives because they were not accepted by our family, society, or ourselves. They do not disappear. They are simply pushed into the unconscious where they continue to influence our emotions, reactions, and relationships. Over time, the shadow becomes a kind of invisible weight that we carry around with us. And without realizing it, we begin to project these repressed contents onto the people around us, especially those closest to us. A talkative relative may irritate us because, deep down, there is a part of us that would like to express itself with the same freedom. A controlling family member may destabilize us because, unconsciously, we also have a desire to exercise control, but we have been taught to suppress it. Family life is the most conducive setting for these projections to surface. Relatives are witnesses to our upbringing. They know who we were, what our mistakes were, our insecurities, our shame. Being with them often confronts us with old versions of ourselves that we would rather forget. That is why, even in silence, the presence of a relative can deeply disturb us. They have done nothing wrong, they have simply activated, without knowing it, a part of our shadow, and the reflection it offers us is not pleasant. Facing this reality is not comfortable, but it is liberating. Recognizing the shadow is the first step toward integrating it, toward ceasing to be hostage to automatic reactions and honestly understanding what hurts us. In doing so, family gatherings cease to be emotional traps and become opportunities for growth. Reason 2. The unconscious family complex. For Carl Jung, a complex is like an emotional island within the psyche, a nucleus formed by memories, experiences, and emotions that carry their own energy. These complexes are usually created in childhood and stored in the unconscious. They do not disappear over time. On the contrary, they can be reactivated at any time in life, especially when we are in contact with the original source of these experiences, the family. Contrary to popular belief, a complex is not necessarily pathological. It can exist in anyone and does not mean madness or lack of control. But Jung warned that the more unconscious the complex, the more it will take control of our emotions and behaviors, and nothing activates a complex as easily as a reunion with relatives. It is common that, even after decades, a simple remark from a sibling or an expression on an uncle's face can awaken intense feelings. You find yourself reacting as if you had gone back in time. The emotion seems disproportionate to the present moment, and this is confusing. But in fact, it is an old complex being activated. If you grew up feeling that you had to please everyone to be accepted, this pattern can be reactivated when you reunite with your family. You strive to be polite, understanding, and present, even if it costs you your peace of mind. If, on the other hand, you lived in an environment where you were constantly criticized or belittled, a single harsh comment is enough for the feeling of inadequacy to return with full force. Family complexes are often the most difficult to identify because they were formed by very close and emotional bonds. Therefore, there is an internal resistance to recognizing them. After all, admitting that you feel uncomfortable with your own relatives can cause guilt, shame, or confusion. But understanding the existence of these emotional cores is a fundamental step toward inner freedom. You don't have to continue submitting to old patterns. By recognizing your complexes, you can choose a new way of relating to others. And often, this involves allowing yourself to set boundaries, distance yourself, or simply prioritize your emotional health. If you like reflections like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. Reason 3. The projection of unhealed wounds. Carl Jung claimed that everything we are not aware of within ourselves will be experienced as fate. One of the most common ways this happens is through projection, a psychological mechanism in which unprocessed feelings, desires, and experiences are transferred to other people. And within the family, these projections are often intense, painful, and silent. When you have an old emotional wound, especially one related to authority figures or loved ones, such as a parent, it is common for those wounds to be reactivated in interactions with other relatives. A brother-in-law may be unconsciously seen as the absent father. A niece may awaken ambivalent feelings related to the daughter you wish you had understood better. A cousin may unwittingly be the target of anger that was never expressed to an older sibling. These projections happen outside of consciousness. They are not planned. They are not the result of malice or manipulation. They are unconscious attempts by the psyche to resolve something that has been left unresolved. And that is precisely why they make family relationships so delicate. You are not just reacting to what the other person is doing today, you are reacting to what they represent. In your emotional history, the problem with projections is that they distort reality. You don't see the other person as they are, but as what your psyche needs them to be in order to make sense of what still hurts. This distortion can lead to conflict, estrangement, and deep misunderstandings, even when neither party is fully aware of what is happening. Recognizing this pattern does not mean taking responsibility for everything that happens in family relationships. It simply means understanding that there are often invisible layers at work behind gestures, words, and resentments, and that the discomfort you feel may have roots much deeper than the immediate situation. Working through these projections is a path to healing. It means looking inward and asking, what pain still lives within me and insists on manifesting itself in others? By answering honestly, you lift the weight of the past from others' shoulders and free yourself for lighter, more authentic relationships. Reason 4. Fear of archetypal judgment. For Jung, archetypes are universal, unconscious images that shape how we perceive the world and ourselves. They do not belong only to the individual, but to the structure of the human psyche. Within the family environment, these archetypes take concrete form in the figures of relatives: the critic, the martyr, the savior, the rival, the outcast. These symbolic roles affect us, even without our realizing it. The fear of judgment we feel in the presence of some family members may actually be an archetypal activation. We are not only facing the real person, but everything they represent to our unconscious. An older relative may embody the archetype of the judge, arousing feelings of inadequacy or guilt. A younger sister may represent the shadow archetype, revealing aspects of ourselves that we would rather keep hidden. This fear of judgment does not need to be verbalized to be felt. Sometimes a glance, a silence, a body posture is enough. The psyche recognizes these signs and quickly triggers internal defenses. You feel observed, compared, analyzed, and this triggers insecurity, withdrawal, or even aggression. Many adults, even mature ones, feel like children again when faced with certain family figures. The critical mother, the demanding father, the competitive brother, all can represent much more than their present attitudes. They represent internal presences, built up over a lifetime, that continue to influence current emotions. Understanding how these archetypes work helps us separate reality from symbolic projection. Not every comment is an attack, not every rigid stance is judgment. But when we are not aware of these dynamics, we interpret others' gestures in light of our oldest fears. Freeing ourselves from the fear of judgment begins with the awareness that these archetypal figures live within us. When we recognize that part of the tension comes from within, and not just from the behavior of others, we can position ourselves with more calm, clarity, and firmness. When we realize that we are no longer children facing invisible authorities, but adults entitled to our own truth, the family environment ceases to be a courtroom and gradually becomes a more authentic meeting place. Reason 5. Lack of individuation in the family system. For Carl Jung, the process of individuation is the path by which a person becomes truly themselves, differentiating themselves from external expectations and inherited roles. It is a long, silent process that usually intensifies with maturity. However, when a person begins to walk this path within a family system where individuation is not valued or even understood, conflict is almost inevitable. The family often functions as a rigid system. Each member occupies a symbolic place: the protector, the caregiver, the obedient one, the rebel. These roles are defined early on and over time become invisible demands. Everyone is expected to behave as they always have, even if they have changed completely internally. When someone begins their process of individuation, they start to question these roles. They no longer want to be just what others determine them to be. They start saying no more often. They value silence. They avoid forced conversations. They set boundaries. These changes are seen by others as coldness, selfishness, or distancing, when in fact they are signs of psychological growth. The problem is that not everyone follows this movement. Relatives who are still stuck in inherited roles tend to react with strangeness or rejection toward those who transform themselves. It is as if the change of one threatens the balance of all. Autonomy comes to be seen as an affront, the desire for peace as disinterest, freedom as disloyalty. Being in a family environment that does not recognize the value of individuation can cause deep discomfort, because the person no longer fits into their old role, but also cannot find space to be who they are now. And this creates a continuous tension between the desire to belong and the need for authenticity. Jung teaches us that true maturity does not require the destruction of bonds, but their transformation. When individuation is respected, bonds are renewed. When it is stifled, encounters become a source of pain. Recognizing this impasse is the first step toward making a clear choice, to remain small in order to fit into old molds, or to grow even if it costs some necessary separations. Reason 6. The repetition of childhood roles. One of the most subtle and at the same time most painful dynamics within family relationships is the unconscious repetition of the roles we assumed in childhood. Carl Jung observed that the human psyche has a natural tendency to cling to familiar structures, even if those structures limit us. This means that even in adulthood, it is common for us to revert to acting as if we were still the child we once were, especially when we are faced with the same figures who shaped our early behavior. You may have built a career, started a family, and matured emotionally. But when you sit down at the table with your siblings or reconnect with your parents, something changes. Your posture adapts. Your voice modulates. You may become more passive, more irritable, or even overly helpful. Not because you want to, but because your psyche, recognizing that environment, automatically reverts to its old role. These roles were useful at one time. They were ways to survive emotionally within a family system that required adaptation. The son who made jokes to lighten the mood, the daughter who took care of everyone to feel accepted, the grandson who kept quiet so as not to be scolded. Each in their own way learned to mold themselves. However, what was once necessary now becomes a prison. When we are not aware of these patterns, they repeat themselves without us noticing. The result is discomfort, a feeling of living a story that no longer makes sense, of playing a role that no longer reflects who we have become. Jung drew attention to the importance of becoming aware of these unconscious structures. Only then can we break the cycle. Realizing how we act automatically is the first step toward regaining our emotional autonomy. The discomfort felt at family gatherings often stems from this incongruity. The adult soul can no longer stand the childish character. When you understand this, you begin to position yourself differently. And even if others still expect you to play the old role, you now have the clarity you need to no longer do so. Reason 7. The silence of repressed emotions. In many families, there is a kind of silent pact. Certain feelings are not welcome. Sadness is ignored, anger is repressed, fear is ridiculed, and deep affection is replaced by practical gestures. Over time, this emotional culture creates an environment where people talk a lot, but communicate little. And this generates a kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with the absence of people, but with the absence of true listening. Carl Jung recognized that what is not consciously expressed ends up manifesting itself in a distorted way. Repressed emotions, especially within the family context, do not disappear. They accumulate and sooner or later emerge in the form of resentment, irritation, or distancing. What could be resolved with honest dialogue turns into heavy silence, forced coexistence, and encounters that leave a bitter taste. Being with relatives who avoid deep conversations can be more exhausting than dealing with open conflicts. Because the silence of emotions is not neutral. It weighs heavily. And as you mature emotionally, you begin to perceive this tension more clearly. The forced laughter, the superficial topics, the averted glances. All of this communicates something, even if it is not said with words. Over time, many people develop a kind of emotional allergy to this type of environment. Not out of contempt, but out of protection. The soul craves authenticity, and when it finds no space to express itself, it begins to withdraw. That's why even seemingly peaceful gatherings can leave you exhausted. It's not what was said that tired you out. It's everything that was avoided. Jung reminds us that the process of individuation involves the integration of the psychic whole. This includes not only conscious thoughts, but also denied emotions. In a family environment that denies emotional depth, this process is constantly interrupted. Recognizing the silence of emotions as a relational obstacle is an important step. Sometimes choosing to distance yourself is not rejection, but an attempt to preserve what little emotional truth you still have. And by doing so consciously, you get closer to yourself, even if it means distancing yourself from others. Reason 8. The pain of invisible loyalty. Many adults carry within themselves a silent loyalty to their family's pain, not because they want to suffer, but because they unconsciously believe that moving on is a form of betrayal. Carl Jung drew attention to the strength of the unconscious bonds that shape our choices, bonds that are often expressed through patterns of repetition and self-sabotage. This loyalty is not explicit. It emerges in seemingly trivial decisions, not allowing oneself to be happy in a new relationship, turning down an opportunity for fear of appearing arrogant, maintaining a limited lifestyle so as not to surpass one's parents or siblings. These are small gestures that reveal an emotional loyalty to the pain of others. This dynamic is especially common in families where there has been a lot of unresolved suffering, loss, trauma, frustration. Growing up in this environment often creates an implicit obligation to continue carrying the collective weight. Being the exception, gaining freedom, or achieving peace can generate guilt. It is as if it were unfair to live lightly when everyone around you has learned to survive through hardship. Jung believed that true emotional maturity comes from recognizing these invisible ties. The process of individuation requires courage to break unconscious pacts that prevent one's life from flourishing. It is not about abandoning others, but about ceasing to inherit their pain as if it were your own. Discomfort with certain relatives may come precisely from this tension. You feel you need to hide your evolution, minimize your achievements, or pretend you are still the same person. All this to avoid destabilizing those who are still stuck in old patterns. And this constant renunciation of yourself causes fatigue, resentment, and alienation. Freeing yourself from this invisible loyalty is not an act of selfishness. It is a movement of consciousness. When you choose to live your truth, even if it makes others uncomfortable or provokes negative reactions, you pave the way for others to do the same. It is a silent invitation to authenticity, which, even if not everyone accepts, can transform an entire generation. Reason 9. The reversal of generational roles. Over the years, it is common for roles within the family to change. Children grow up, parents age, and the cycle of life requires adaptation. However, in many families, this transition does not happen in a balanced way. Instead of being a natural process, it becomes a painful reversal of roles where the mature adult becomes the emotional, financial, and practical pillar for everyone around them. Carl Jung believed that psychological imbalances within family systems cause deep tensions in the unconscious. When a person, already in their maturity, finds themselves carrying responsibilities that previously belonged to other generations, something inside them begins to wear away. It is not just physical fatigue, but a symbolic overload, the feeling of sustaining a structure that should be more balanced. In many homes, children become parents to their own parents. Daughters take on the emotional care of their sick mothers, control the finances, and resolve conflicts. In other cases, grandparents have to support their grandchildren while their parents are away. This role reversal disrupts the natural order and creates a type of wear and tear that often goes unrecognized, both by others and by those experiencing it. The discomfort of being around certain relatives may stem from this silent exhaustion. You love, care, and show concern, but you feel that you have exceeded your own limits. And yet, the demands continue. There is no room for rest or vulnerability. You are expected to be strong, available, and decisive. However, the truth is that every adult also needs support, listening, and freedom. Jung emphasized the importance of each person occupying their rightful place in the symbolic order of life. When this does not happen, the psyche reacts with suffering. The reversal of roles erodes bonds, empties affection, and transforms care into obligation. Recognizing this imbalance is an essential step in regaining your self-worth. Saying no when necessary does not mean abandonment. It often means protecting what is still healthy within you. And in doing so, you honor your history without allowing it to continue repeating itself at the expense of your peace. Reason 10. Silent transgenerational trauma. Carl Jung said that what is not faced in one generation will be inherited by the next. He understood that the individual psyche is intertwined with the collective psyche, especially within families. This means that traumas not processed by parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents remain alive, even if they have never been named. They do not disappear, they just disguise themselves. In many families, there is pain that has not been digested, early losses, veiled abuse, emotional violence, hidden secrets. These experiences are stored in the family unconscious, circulating as a dense energy that spans the years. And even without knowing why, descendants feel the weight of these events. You may have grown up in an environment where no one talked about suffering, where emotions were contained and the past was avoided. And yet you carry within you a sadness that has no clear origin, an anxiety with no obvious cause, a fear that does not seem to belong only to you. These feelings may be expressions of trauma that is not yours, but that you have inherited. This process is called transgenerational transmission. Jung observed that the unconscious carries not only individual experiences, but also family and collective content, and that many inner conflicts only make sense when viewed within this broader context. Being with certain relatives can be difficult, because together, you form the field where these traumas circulate. Even without talking about them, bodies feel, silences weigh heavily, and unspoken words echo. There is tension in the air that does not come from today, it comes from long before. Recognizing that you may be living under the influence of a history that is not entirely yours is liberating. Not to blame the past, but to understand it clearly. When you name inherited pain, it loses some of the power it has over your life. Jung believed that bringing the unconscious to consciousness is an act of healing, and that includes looking at what your family was never able to say. By doing so, you not only free yourself, but you break the cycle so that future generations don't have to carry what no longer belongs to them. Reason 11. Envy and the unacknowledged shadow. Envy is one of the most repressed feelings within families. It is denied, camouflaged, or disguised by irony, subtle criticism, and ambiguous compliments. Carl Jung saw envy as a manifestation of the shadow, that part of the psyche that brings together everything that has been repressed, forgotten, or rejected because it does not fit moral or social standards. In family life, envy does not usually manifest itself directly. No one openly says they are jealous of their brother's tranquility, their niece's success, or their cousin's happiness. But it reveals itself in small gestures, in a snide comment, in absence at important moments, in attempts to discreetly diminish another's achievements. When unacknowledged, this type of feeling contaminates relationships. The unintegrated shadow begins to act unconsciously. Those who feel envy do not realize that they are acting destructively, and those who are the target of envy often feel uneasy, but cannot put their finger on what is happening. There is a feeling of discomfort that something is not right, even when everything seems cordial. Jung reminds us that the problem is not feeling envy, a human and natural feeling, but not recognizing its existence. Denied envy gains strength, begins to express itself in indirect behaviors, and fuels tensions that make coexistence unsustainable. In families, this is even more delicate, as there is an expectation of unconditional love and mutual support. When envy appears, it hurts this expectation, creating guilt, shame, and distance. The discomfort you feel around certain relatives may stem from this very source. You sense, even without proof, that there is something behind the smiles, a silent competition, an invisible dispute for recognition, affection, or status. And this emotional climate weighs heavily, tires and wears you down. Looking at this with awareness is essential. Jung believed that by integrating the shadow, we find a new level of authenticity. Recognizing envy, whether in yourself or in others, is a step toward restoring truth in relationships. And often this truth needs to be accompanied by distance, so that respect can once again occupy the space that silence can no longer sustain. Reason 12. The pressure to play a role that is no longer yours. One of the deepest reasons for discomfort at family gatherings is the expectation that you will continue to play a role that no longer corresponds to the person you have become. Carl Jung said that the human personality is a process of constant transformation, and that part of suffering comes from trying to maintain a mask that no longer fits us, what he called the persona. In our youth, many of us take on roles to survive emotionally. The obedient child, the peacemaking sister, the relative everyone turns to when there is conflict. These roles are built on the demands of our environment, family silences, and the unmet needs of others. Over time, these behaviors become crystallized. They become part of the image others have of us. The problem arises when we grow up inside, but others continue to relate to the old version. You have matured, grown tired of always being responsible, of being available to everyone, of accepting jokes that hurt. But when you show this, the reaction is immediate. What happened to you? You're so different. You've become more closed off. You used to be so helpful. This pressure is subtle but constant. It's as if your emotional transformation bothers them because it disrupts the established family dynamic. The old persona made sense to others, and now, by refusing to use it, you become a stranger in that environment. And that's where the discomfort arises, not because of who you are, but because of who they expect you to continue being. Jung saw individuation as the process of freeing oneself from the persona, integrating the shadow, and living authentically. This takes courage, especially in front of family, where expectations are more rigid. The pressure to play old roles can be a form of unconscious control. But when you refuse to obey this script, you begin to write your own story. Feeling uncomfortable around certain relatives may be a clear sign that you have grown up and that you are no longer willing to fit where you once forced yourself to fit. Perhaps you have distanced yourself from some relatives. Perhaps you only see them out of obligation, without the light-heartedness or affection of the past. And perhaps you have carried guilt for this, guilt for no longer feeling the same desire, for not maintaining the same enthusiasm, for not living up to expectations of presence and affection that once seemed natural. But today, with everything you've been through, you may be able to look at this distance with different eyes. Carl Jung said that what we do not confront within ourselves, we will encounter as our destiny. This simple phrase reveals an essential truth. Being with relatives can be difficult, not only because of who they are, but because of what they represent. In their presence, we are called upon to deal with parts of ourselves that are still in conflict, memories that have not been healed, patterns that have not been broken, feelings that have never been acknowledged. Family is the first mirror of the soul. It is where we learn to love, but also where we learn to silence ourselves, to keep quiet, to avoid rejection, to give in to ensure affection. And over the years, these conditioning factors gain strength. We grow up, we change, we mature, but often we are still treated as if we were the same as always, and that hurts. But maturing, as Jung said, is also becoming whole. And wholeness requires choices. Some of these choices are internal, recognizing what we feel without denying it. Others are external, redrawing the boundaries of our relationships. And yes, sometimes that means keeping our distance, not out of contempt, but out of care. Because growing up also means knowing how far we can go without losing ourselves again. Distance can often be the most loving gesture we can offer. It is the space where we can breathe, reflect, and rediscover our voice. And when we return, if we return, we no longer return to the same place. We return more lucid, more whole, more free to be who we have become. The truth is that not every bond needs to remain the same. Some relationships change. Others need to be left behind. And that doesn't make you a cold person. It makes you someone who has started to listen to themselves, someone who understands that emotional health has value, That preserving your peace is not selfish, it is responsibility for your own existence. Jung reminded us that individuation, the process of becoming who you are, cannot be experienced without conflict. And one of the greatest conflicts is precisely in disappointing those who expected us to remain as we were. But this pain is temporary. The pain of betraying yourself to please others, on the other hand, repeats itself throughout life. Perhaps now you can see that family discomfort is not a personal flaw. It is a symptom of awareness. It is a sign that something has changed, grown, awakened, and it is with this new perspective that you can choose how, and with whom, you want to continue living. Family can be a home, but only when it ceases to be an emotional prison, when affection is free, when love does not require masks, when silence is not imposed but chosen, when presence does not come out of obligation but out of a real desire to share. In the end, living well with others always begins with living in peace with yourself, because it is from this peace that respect is born. It is what allows us to set boundaries without fear. It is what gives us the strength not to give in to what hurts us, nor to insist on what no longer sustains us. Distance is not contempt. Sometimes it is wisdom, and knowing how to recognize this, with serenity, firmness, and truth, is one of the greatest signs of emotional maturity that anyone can achieve. If this reflection made sense to you, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to receive more reflections like this. That way you won't miss any new content. Take care and see you next time.